Hot Shoe Productions has been holding conversational roundtables throughout the year. We want to amplify the voices of communities that are Black, Indigenous, and people of color who continue to advocate for change. Welcome to another episode of the documentary series, Advocacy as Education. In this episode, we had the privilege to bring together 5 different community leaders.
My name is Gabrielle Fayant.
I'm Emmanuel, Duala, Ekoko.
Greetings, my name is Jamaal Jackson Rogers.
My name is Tyler Kumiye Boyce.
Hi, my name is Alia Farhat.
They have a conversation about the challenges of transitioning from youth to adulthood based on questions that we provided them. Each participant scales their answer from 1 to 10. Whoever ranks it the highest and lowest justifies why, and the other leaders can pitch in for more insight.
I'll let Gabby go first.
No,
Okay, I'll go. Yeah, so there's 2 parts to this question, right? Like the first part is, do you agree or disagree that discrimination can force, Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks to leave their jobs? And I would 100% agree with that. I think that it's true. And the second part of the question is sort of, what should nonprofit organizations and the city of Ottawa do to rectify that? Yeah. You're gonna catch some smoke on the last part, but I'll explain the first part first. I think that the hardest part about working, and I speak from the experience like as a Black person, but also as a queer person, like the hardest part about working is navigating my experience with those identities. I think it was in high school, we wanted to organize our first Black History Month assembly. So all the few Black kids in the school, we were like, why don't we ever do anything for Black History Month? And there was so much pushback. It was like, why would we? We can call it a multicultural month, but we're not talking about Blackness. And we had to protest and argue and advocate for ourselves just to talk about ourselves as Black people, to say that we have a distinct experience in the world, but especially in that school. And then you kind of move on to university, and that was my first place where I understood that, this is just the work that I want to do. I want to do racial justice work moving forward, and it doesn't matter if people say that I'm allowed to or not. And I did that. My first day of my master's program, I was told by a racialized student, after class, being like, hey, keep talking about all this Black stuff and it's going to take opportunities away from you. No one's going to want to work with you. The teachers are going to get offended. You can't say Black when you're talking to white people. And again, it's just that common theme of navigating what you can and cannot say, who you can and cannot be, and what parts of your experience are allowed in an institution. And then you move from school to your workplaces, and it's the exact same thing. It's you are only allowed to be this palatable, this acceptable kind of Black person. And I have always left those positions. I've had the benefit of working for Black women most of my career, and that is because I chose to do that, because those were the only places that I could be nurtured in. I was one of the people who quit government during the pandemic. I did a year there. I don't know how I ended up there. And I was just navigating whiteness is such a barrier towards transformative change. And if you want to work, live, thrive, commit to arenas of change, you're not gonna find that in a place that values whiteness more than justice. So people leaving, that's the truth. Now it's about who should be doing the work to fix that, because that's messed up. No one should have to deal with that. And my problem with the question is that it poses the city of Ottawa and nonprofit institutions as the actors that are gonna create change around that. My God, they're not. They're not. They're not. History has proven that. The function of the city of Ottawa, the function of the nonprofit industrial complex these are not the actors that were going to move us in a radical direction. Any expansion of the human rights for people, Black people, Indigenous people, racialized people, like the only expansion of human rights will come from the people themselves, like from grassroots movements, from people that are willing to like lay it all on the line, not for a salary, but because it's something that they actually believe in. The city of Ottawa has been an active agent of fueling anti-Black racism in this city. The increase of the police budget, despite the overrepresentation of folks that look like me being attacked by the police, is like point period case. And then like nonprofit institutions have largely been a place where Black people, racialized folks are just propped up when it can benefit the white leaders in that sector. But when it comes to actually, talking about the change that has to happen, that includes a new imagination of what power could look like in a nonprofit, when it comes to actually challenging the status quo to do work in a different way, suddenly we move from that model minority to a problem. So what we take away from sort of like my sharing of the question is like making sure we remember where change comes from, make sure we remember why we have nonprofits, and it's because of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people like challenging the status quo in a really radical way. And then just always being like aware and remembering that existing in these institutions is a constant act of resistance. And not all of us get to find the places where we can truly believe that we exist in an arena of change. But I'm super curious to hear like what other people feel about that, like why you put the numbers that you put. So in no particular order, sort of, how does everyone else feel?
Okay, well, I shared in your scale, I also wrote 10, just because thinking of my background and navigating my first few jobs as a youth, you're not, you're eligible to work at the age as young as 15. And due to like my background in a low-income family, like I took that opportunity to find employment, and it's very scarce, right? You don't have the assets, the skills. Like your resume basically says I can talk to people, and so you're usually like boxed into either like the camp counselor role or the retail role or like flipping burgers. Like it's very limited, right? Yeah. And so one of my first jobs was working with the city of Ottawa, and I saw that. Comparing that to working with a company like Sears and retail, right? Working with Sears, like for one, I wasn't able to take time on break to pray, right, on time. And so, for example, they would offer an extra 5-minute break for smoking. And it's like, how could you not, because your policy doesn't include that, right? So I could see why that could be a barrier for youth in employment and why it would trigger them not to stay, because I know I didn't feel as accommodated. Whereas working with the city of Ottawa, because I grew up not having someone who wore a hijab be my camp counselor or within the community seeing them. And it depends on the time period in which you like kind of grew up in Ottawa, because at one point, a majority was obviously Caucasian, and then as more immigration came in, you had like the influx of the diaspora of like the African Americans, the Asian, Caribbean, so on and so forth. And at one point, I was part of the group of youth who were brought into the city of Ottawa to provide better representation. But it took me up until becoming an adult in university to realize that, like, why am I limiting myself to the position of the leader of a camp group versus organizing my own camp for youth who are not part, you know what I mean? So the second part of the question where it's like, oh, can nonprofits or like the city of Ottawa assist in that? It's like, yeah, they could provide funding for racialized youth to take the initiative to start their own programs. I don't see the system putting them as leaders in the city of Ottawa as much, right? Because that's just not how the system is built. My position currently, I'm the program coordinator for Youth Ottawa, and we're working on the Ottawa Youth Engagement Committee, and essentially trying to bring youth voices to policy, right? And that's a big ask for the government themselves. Like, it's one thing to say, hey, organize some youth, and we want to hear what their issues about our policy and whatnot are. And it's another way, like another thing to ask the city to actually accommodate for those changes, right? So I'm really hoping for like when we do finally launch this program, we get a diverse perspective from youth all across Ottawa, from different cultures, social backgrounds, and hopefully affect change. But I guess that's my response to the second half of the question is the only way is if funding and the rights are put in the hands of those who are feeling discriminated. Yeah.
That's good. I can jump in. Next. Okay. So discriminations, for me, this question, this topic is very, very deep. Coming in as an immigrant, I bring in a perspective to it where every immigrant, true immigrant who left their country, came to Canada for greener pastures, can relate to this, what I'm about to say now. When you come in here as an international student, which I came in as, you pay huge fees, like crazy money. That's something which is not mainstream told, that you pay like 10 times more than Canadians pay. So you got to pay that money. And that money, you need to work somehow to get it. But to work, you need connections. To even get a reference for your resume, coming in as an immigrant, who do you know to give you those references? Nobody. Right? So you get stuck in a circle where you're applying for jobs using maybe your experiences from back home or your degrees from back home, and no one recognizes them. Why? You need a Canadian experience. That already is a huge barrier for those who come into Canada. When you say, oh, if you don't have Canadian experience, you can't get employed, you can't get a job. But they have lots of experience. They have, well, you need to bring reference of people who are credible in the society. Maybe like a social worker you worked with, like someplace your manager, or someone who has worked with you. But if you don't have this, how do you start even working when they say it poses a challenges to securing a job, employment, yeah, for anyone who comes as an immigrant. How do you secure even your first job if you cannot get a job without Canadian experience? So most times you have to improvise, tell lies, put people's names who are not there and get the job. I did it. Many people did. We get good jobs, but they were all lies because we had to improvise to get in. Otherwise, you don't. And that's already a huge gap. It poses a huge challenge. If a youth comes in and he has to practice mafia to get in, guess what? You're already grooming him to tell him that if you're not canny and smart enough to navigate our stumbling blocks, you're not going to go anywhere. And most times this poses a huge challenges to youths who come in, youths who are struggling, who are barely trying to keep up with things. And then you have to pay some crazy amount of fees. Sometimes if you're international student and you have to pay all this amount of fees, it takes a huge toll on your mental health. Whether it's paid for by your family or not, you have to pay it back somehow. So it takes a huge toll on your mental health, and you don't get any assistance from the system yet at all, like nothing. Yeah, so that alone already is a huge limitation. Okay, after that, I'll go now to getting the job as a racialized Black person. I worked with a few non-for-profits after I finished my social service program at Algonquin, and it wasn't a nice place to be at. It wasn't. Most of the organized non-for-profits that are claiming to serve youth social programs, they have no youth, no social program. Everything is just upfront. It's a diagram, it's a picture to show that things have been done, but most of them do nothing. They don't even see youth. They'll forge numbers and stuff to show to the government and fill in documents, but they use that want these programs. But it's gonna take a huge responsibility to run it, and people don't want to do that. They rather make it shambles so they can keep the money for these projects. And this now weighs back now on the community. And most times, like what you said, if you're not aligned with these things, you're out. And so you're kicked out because you're not aligning with the objectives of where they want, how things are done here, right? So that's how part of the project I run, Active Newcomer Youth, comes in, where I felt like dissatisfied with social programming in the city and how those in the position to create change use it for their self-benefit. And you have all these youth who are into art, music, and other things, but their voices are not being heard. They're having zero opportunities in the city of where there's so much opportunities, where the government maybe give grants and money to run these programs, but they don't have those opportunities, those who really want it and those who really need it, the marginalized youth. They do not have these opportunities. So that already creates a very big limitation. And having non-for-profits that are actually doing these things and running it and having money being filtered, being checked, all these NGOs should be checked. They should do like auditing, deep auditing. If they want to actually make a change, that's what they should do. They should do deep auditing. I don't want to call any names, but if they go into deep auditing into these programs, nothing is being done. It's just a shamble being put in up front, saying we're doing it, we're doing it. But if you look deep, nobody came. No one says anybody. So how that already alone is a disservice to it, right? And you can't walk in that. If you oppose the systems, it's already, you see what I mean? So lots of things need to change in the work field to give racialized youths more opportunities to express themselves and to contribute what they can to the society. If you don't give them an opportunity because it was too white, mainstream, Canadian, and we cannot change it because this is how it's been done for long, then guess what? It's not inclusive. So you cannot have me working in something I don't feel included in, right? So you lose good staffs and good people ready to work because this is how it was done. Yeah, or don't change it. Let's not revamp these programs and make it more inclusive, or let's go with what the youth want. Is it like that's most of the time that's some challenges you face working in this field and working in some of these programs?
Absolutely. And I don't think that you're alone in feeling like
No,
nonprofits.
I'm not.
Yeah,
I'm not.
you're not alone in believing in feeling that way.
There's a lot of people who feel dissatisfied. Even I've had it from other places like Social Planning Council of Ottawa. They have these things coming up too, these issues coming up of like youth violence with guns, and they're addressing these things of why is this occurring at a higher rate and all that. It's because they are not having any social programming running. Though they give $3 million to these non-for-profits to run these programs, nothing has been done. So guess what happens? The youths are out in the streets trying to make themselves social, trying to find things going for themselves. And that only results to what you get.
I think it's also just like, what programs are the youth going to? Like, it's one thing to like have a program. It's another thing to make sure that youth feel comfortable going to those spaces.
Yeah.
So like this question is about just like all the racism that like we experience in institutions of employment. And then now it's sort of like, if we're gonna bring youth into these institutions to receive services, let's make sure that the right people are coordinating those programs. Let's make sure that the right people are designing those programs. Let's make sure that the right mentors are there to like advise on what this should actually look like. And because one thing to have something, it's like something completely different to make sure that that program actually makes an impact in the world.
Yeah, is it serving the people? We have how many thousands of youths? Are they coming? Is that what they want? How do we revamp it so it's inclusive to what they want and not what we think they need?
Could I jump in on this
Yeah.
one? It might be like a good segue, but like 100%, like you know, a lot of the youth I work with, they literally just quit their jobs because they're being discriminated against, harassed. You know, and like even yesterday, there was a youth that quit his job because he was being harassed. He works in construction, right? And so like that's like a whole industry that needs a lot of work on. You know, that's like family businesses, right? And so like the nepotism in there, like no one, my nephew wouldn't do that, you know, like my uncle's not racist kind of vibes. But yeah, youth are just quitting them, and these are like the jobs that a lot of young people need, because again, like going back to the university question, is like a lot of Indigenous youth aren't graduating high school or university or post-secondary of any kind. And so these trades are really, really important, you know. And but then when you get into the trades, these businesses are run by, you know, families that have benefited off of colonization for generations and generations. And so it's really brutal. And then going to the nonprofit conversation, there's all these nonprofits talking about, let's get Indigenous youth employed. And it's the first thing, they always want to get us employed. Wait a minute, like, let's actually get our needs met first. You know, like we're living in severe poverty, like even in the city. People think that natives, we only live on reserves or like far away, but we're literally in the cities. Like I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment my whole life, and like 2 of the bedrooms had no windows. Like I'm pretty sure that's not even
That's a code violation.
exactly. That's what like a lot of youth are living with. You know, we have to live in these places because it's the only places we can afford. You know, we live, a lot of us, we call it Vanier First Nations, because like that's where we all live, especially when we come to Ottawa. And it's rough in Vanier, you know, like there's people I know that have lived in Vanier all their lives, and literally like one youth, their mother was murdered in Vanier. You know, there's a lot of sex work that happens in Vanier. And it, you know, I was at 7-Eleven in Vanier like maybe like a year ago, and I literally just left the store. I was standing outside for 30 seconds, and a van pulls up. A dude gets out of his van and passes me like a paper, and it says on the paper like, call me for a good time, that's my number. Like I was only out there for 30 seconds, like, you know. And so this is the kind of stuff we're dealing with, but yet these nonprofits are like, let's get you employed. It's like, no, like I need my safety. I need a good house to live in, a decent house, not even a good house, a decent house is what we're striving for right now, decency. And yeah, it's really, really brutal. And then on top of that, you know, there's this huge hunger from Indigenous youth to take back everything that was stolen from us. You know, not just like our livelihoods and decency, but our languages, our cultures, our land, our clothing, our medicines, like all of it. You know, so we're struggling like that, but we're still having to do all this advocacy work. And that whole conversation about reconciliation, it's on our shoulders. Like we didn't create these schools, we didn't create residential schools, but we're having to clean up the mess. How is that even fair? So yeah, these nonprofits, it's just like really out of control. And that's why we created A7G. So like I run a nonprofit. We don't run it like any nonprofit you've seen. We're super grassroots. We say no to a lot of money because it's tied to really violent things like resource extraction. Even like cigarette companies want to give us money, and we just have to say no and like stick to our integrity. And the youth trust us, and that is what counts the most. Is like young people have to trust you. If they don't trust you, if you're letting in like perpetrators into your organization that are running the show, they're not gonna stick around. You know, meanwhile, like there's multi-million-dollar organizations that keep saying like, we work with youth, and there's no youth that show up.
Exactly.
And like we're working with like, we're actually carrying like so much of the load. Like our core group of youth is about 30 young people. And it's not like a program type vibe. It's like literally, okay, you have housing, you have a job, you have money, you have food. It's more than just like a program. It's holistic. It's taking care of folks, you know, reminding folks that they belong somewhere, that people care about them, you know, and they don't get that anywhere else. I mean, while we're like surviving off of like little like scraps here and there, and we won't stop doing the work though. Doesn't matter how many times like folks try to squash us out or, you know, take away funds or any of these things. We do it because it's survival. Like if we're not there, who's there? Nobody. You know, a lot of these nonprofits, they shut their door at 5 p.m. Everybody goes home. Like we all know that a crisis doesn't happen between 9 to 5. Crisis happens like at 3 in the morning. And you know, we're the ones who are like checking our phones at 3 in the morning, like, oh no, like let's get you Uber to like a hotel because you need a safe place to go right now type of vibes. So yeah, the whole nonprofit industrial complex is so sick. And the city of Ottawa is really sick itself, you know, investing in continued police violence where Indigenous people are being killed by police also, you know, and it's so violent. And they're always trying to get police into schools. And it's like we've done youth programming for years now. We've never once had to call the police. Never needed police around. So I don't know like why all this police presence is even needed. And you know, if it was any other group, any other organization, they're like literally killing people and you're giving them more money. Imagine if it was any nonprofit and someone died at a nonprofit. You'd take their money so quickly. But yet this organization, police organization, continues to get more investments. It's so disgusting. But the city of Ottawa too, like, and that's something I hope that we can do better is like share our stories better. Because sometimes what happens for Indigenous folks is we just talk to each other. You know, we don't share our stories well enough. And then other communities don't realize what's going on. But it's really hard. It's really hard to like have to struggle, but also be an advocate for yourself. And, you know, as much as folks want to say like, oh, if there's, you know, discrimination happening at the workplace, you can, you know, call the union or you can file a human rights complaint. It's like, no, do you know how hard that is? Like to even understand how to file that complaint or put your experience into that kind of words, you know, it's next to impossible.
And even then they'll give you like some funding, but like the trauma that you endure with certain like workplace violence is like no one's gonna be able to help you with that after you. So that's another one.
Yeah. So anyways, that's my rant. Sorry.
I think there are a lot of parts of it that stuck with me. Like no matter how hard they try to like squash out like the work that's that's happening. Like right now we're using like the structure of a nonprofit and trying to remix it as much as we can to affect that change. Take funding away from that structure and we're gonna build something else. And like that's the story of time. We're always gonna build a way to do the work. Right now it might look a certain way. In 10 years it's gonna look completely different. So I really love that.
Yeah, and I think like also if you think of the structure currently, it's like a lot of adults who are running these non-for-profits. And it's like if youth are running the non-for-profits, then, or not running this, well, because youth is, depending on the program you're at or depending on what reference you use, it's like youth is either from 15 to 20 or like 15 to 18. In most non-for-profits or most city-run programs, it's at the cap of when they reach adulthood. So like 18, but of course adulthood, the term adulthood is also like just like a concept, right? Like depending on what maturity level or like what stage of life you're in, like youth and adult can vary. But that's why like one thing that the program we're trying to run with Youth Ottawa is it's supposed to be youth advocating for youth, and it's youth run. Like we provide whatever the youth need in resources when they come to us, whether they need a space to actually meet, where they need a space to like, or like some like a Zoom account so that they can actually communicate or whatever. But essentially they're running the dialogue, like they're running what policies they see they want to change. Whether it's, I know one of our programs that are ironically in the elementary or the high schools, is the ACI program, which is like the Active Citizenship Initiative. And one of the outcomes of that was that youth want to lower the voting age to 16 because they see that a lot of the policies are made that are restricting them, obviously, to either work or there's just a lot. Like some other points were, oh, like we can drive a car, that like someone can die from me crashing into someone, so you're gonna give me that responsibility, but like you can't let me vote for whose policy I want. So that's just an example of how like youth can benefit from certain non-for-profits. I 100% agree with a lot of your opinions on the violence and the misuse of position that some non-for-profits do. But I hope to see like more youth take initiative, and like if they're running the programs as well. Like I categorize myself as a youth because I'm under 30. So just us here sitting on a table, being entrepreneurs, being able to affect change, like that's the first step as well.
Show the score first.
Freedom of speech. So I'm an artist, and of course I use, my artistic license to share my views about things, and I value that extremely. So do I believe that freedom of speech is always a necessary construct for society? I believe it's so. The construct of freedom of speech is absolutely necessary, because we know what happens when you're silenced, right? It's a form of oppression. But of course, it's that being said, having regulations around freedom of speech is important because words can be harmful, right? Speech can target and be used to abuse individuals, even including yourself. So, regulations that people understand and can identify with would make sense. So that's why I ranked it 9, because I do believe it's a necessary construct for humans to have an environment where freedom of speech is highly valued and necessary. And then the second part of the question was discuss how abolishing this would affect the upcoming generations. So as we progress as a society, we're starting to see different challenges that we're being faced by. Some of these challenges were things that came into our lives many years, decades, hundreds of years prior to us being here, and then some are new. Abolishing freedom of speech would create a vacuum that's definitely not going to help society, especially for the upcoming generations who are going to inherit what we're leaving behind, in a sense, right? And so that being the case, which is kind of, it feels like sometimes that's what's happening, right? The younger generations, they're becoming more aware now of the inequity of the world and how it's like, the ripple effects pretty much permeate everything. Now imagine removing a level of freedom of speech. I'm pretty sure people in power definitely want that. They don't, having the masses quiet and having them not being able to voice their concerns keeps people in power, So abolishing it would affect the future generations to make the change needed to bring back a balance in the lifestyles and in the way people experience life. And so it costs us all removing freedom of speech. But I do think that there needs to be a framework of justice that makes sure that freedom of speech is not abused in a sense where we could just use it willy-nilly, because words generate, life. Words generate life. From when you say I love you, when you say I hate you or I hate this, it generates an experience. It generates life for us. So that's what I would say about that.
Okay, I think what you said makes a lot of sense, and it is like what society should be technically, but is it what it is? So for me, yeah, freedom of speech is always necessary in the society. Yeah, I would strongly agree with that, but I rated it low because, well, is there really freedom of speech? That's I think that should be a question we should ask ourselves globally, not just uh, because at first you think, oh, maybe in the third world countries that's where you see this, but we saw this firsthand here in Canada as well when the truckers' protests happened. The media, it was swayed one side. When you sway a media to talk about things one side, and then we go on the streets, we go out there, we see things differently, is there freedom of speech? Because then it's people are being led to know what they want to tell you most of the time, and this is modern media nowadays. It's mostly either being manipulated or uh, the opinions of the maybe the left wing is just totally shut aside or viewed as terrorist or racist or all that. And yes, killing freedom of speech, taking it out or abolishing it would affect upcoming generations like it's already doing now. Because then there's lack of freedom of expression, self-expression is very important. Feeling like your rights matter, feeling like your opinions matter is also very important. And I think future generations would have to learn from our experiences of how freedom of speech has been categorized nowadays and the effects it's having on our community and our society as a whole, be it North America, Europe, or wherever. We can clearly see how it is uh, having a big effect and how things are being done and how the consequences are. Yeah.
For me, like, you know, the question of freedom of speech and like whether it's like always necessary, like I'll answer it in two ways. So like the first way is that freedom of speech is incredibly important to be able to say your views. Like Jamaal, you kind of saying how like words shape life really resonated with me because it's so true. At the same time, you know, like my gut reaction is like there needs to be limits to what can be said. Like people who are saying like, you know, trans women are not women. Like, I don't think I think it's hateful, and I think we need to like acknowledge the pain of sharing views like that. There was a time where people would say Black people are not human, and I think that has a place to like push society in the direction that we need to go in? Absolutely not. But like I put it an 8 because for me, and this is just like who I am as a person, I like people to be upfront about where it is you're at. If you don't like me because I'm queer or because I'm Black, if you think certain things because of me based on those identities, I'd rather that you tell me to my face and not smile to my face and then go behind my back and say, you know what, I'm gonna use my power to make sure this person does not get to create the change that they wanna see in this world. So be upfront about it. You know, another thing that Emmanuel brought up was the truckers' protest. For me, as like a resident of Ottawa, that was a really scary time. And I think, you know, what I was happy about, whether I agree or disagree with the views being shown at the truckers' protest, I was happy that people were out there expressing how they feel, because something happens when you take away freedom of speech and it just pushes things underground. And we can see that when we talk about like underground white supremacist movements. We can talk that when we look at like underground misogynist movements. And the more that we push people, the more that they're gonna organize in really dangerous ways. And there's something very dangerous about the shadows. So when we talk about freedom of speech, you know, be upfront about it. And I think that for these next generations is something that we need to have a real conversation about. There should be parameters, you know, boundaries. We should acknowledge the impact of words, but at the very same time, we should be very aware of what happens when you say someone can't say something. They're gonna say it anyways, and they're gonna say it in ways that can actually push us away from the radical direction that we're hoping to push society in.
Yeah, I think like I had a little trouble rating this just because I had a different lens originally. Because on one hand, it's like to say freedom of speech is the freedom to say what you would like, but then it's like speech is also in relation to language, in relation to culture, and it's like your freedom to use the type of speech you would like and what language. And just like looking at the different languages in the world, like a lot of, like the Spanish and the French, like certain words have masculine and feminine connotations to them, as an example. And it's interesting that like in English, you say like, I broke my arm, instead of like, my arm is broken, if you were to translate it from like the Spanish dialect, right? To say that you broke your arm, like that's something psychotic. Like I personally like went out of my way to break my arm, right? So I don't know why I was having like a little bit of a trouble seeing like the lens of that and like how that will bring freedom, because we were talking earlier about like the French and the English side of where you're from and Cameroon, and how the freedom of speech and choice of speech that affected what people were able to do essentially, right? And then we also talked about like the colonization and how like English is now taught in Canada, right? As like the first language. We are bilingual, so we speak French and we're speaking English here, right? But do I have the freedom to say something in Arabic in right now? And you guys would obviously feel excluded, right? It might be something, just me speaking on the phone with my mom or my dad about something in Arabic, right? Like, do I have that freedom? How does that make others feel in the situation? So I had two sides of things, but I also believe that censorship is definitely a form of oppression. And Jamaal being an artist, and artists I feel like are the most like their platform just is affected most heavily, if anything, and those who are already obviously oppressed. But yeah, I had a lot of different lenses going on with this question, just because like the term speech could mean so many things, right? And how you like the platform you're in, how it affects how you use it.
Yeah, and so I guess just a few things for me when it comes to freedom of speech. Like again, like going to the language, English is such a simplistic language. Like, there's things that don't make sense. There's not enough words to properly explain like how you truly feel. There's not enough descriptive words, and so much gets lost in translation. Like I could say one thing to someone and it means something totally different to them, which is like very different than a lot of other languages. But yeah, exactly. Like, if I spoke in Cree right now, who would understand me? And so like having that conversation about what does freedom even mean? Like whose freedom are we talking about? Like, are we talking about the freedom to participate in like white supremacy? Or are we actually talking about like Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty? That's the kind of freedom I'm when I say freedom, that's what I'm thinking about. And then the other part about freedom of speech is that there has to be that, and that's why I rated it like just a little bit lower than 10, just because I think there also has to be a conversation about equity in freedom of speech. So it's not everybody's voice is held up in the same way. And so I think about all those children that were at those residential schools, how many times they said that they were being abused, that they were being violated and harmed. No one listened to them. Their graves had to be found in masses for someone to finally listen, and yeah, so freedom of speech is a whole a whole conversation with so many nuances, like all of these questions. And so I am grateful, though, that we're able to talk about all of these questions and these topics because we're able to share in the same language.